Hello and welcome to the Institute for China America Studies' American Voices Initiative discussion series interview. I am Saurabh Gupta. I am head of the Trade and Technology program at the Institute, and the interview will be conducted by my colleague Matthew Garesi, who is research associate and program manager at the Institute. Today, we are fortunate to have a gentleman who has worked at the highest levels of international education exchanges, U.S. China educational exchanges, Dr. Denis Simon. U.S. China educational exchanges have thrived over the past 3 to 4 decades as U.S. China relations improved since the normalization of ties in 1979. In the last few years, though, there has been pressure on this relationship, which has also had its effect on international student exchanges. There have been various Justice Department probes that have been conducted at this point of time, and there's a general cloud hanging over US China student exchanges. The good news is that of late, there are a lot of Chinese students back at US universities, and we hope that it stays that way. Allow me at this point of time to introduce our distinguished American Voices interview series guest, Dr. Denis Simon. Dr. Simon is Senior Advisor to the President for China Affairs at Duke University and Professor of China Business and Technology at Duke's Fuqua School of Business. He is also a Senior Advisor to the Institute for China America Studies. Dr. Simon is fluent in Mandarin Chinese and has 4 decades of experience studying business, competition, innovation, and technology strategy in China. In 2006, he was awarded the China National Friendship Award by Premier Wen Jiabao in Beijing. Prior to returning to Duke, Dr. Simon served as Executive Vice Chancellor at Duke Kunshan University in China from 2015 to 2020. Dr. Simon is best placed to speak on these issues, and we look forward to this interview with him. Just as a matter of just Dr. Simon holds an MA in Asian Studies and a PhD in Political Science from UC Berkeley. As I mentioned, he speaks and reads Chinese. Matt, please go ahead, take it away and with the interview. Thanks.
Thank you, Saurabh, for the kind introduction, and thank you again, Dr. Simon, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. So, Professor Simon, you've had the opportunity to live and work in China, leading a Sino-US joint venture university for 5 years from 2015 to 2020 in the capacity of its Executive Vice Chancellor. Could you give our audience an overview of your hands-on experience, having been at the heart of U.S. China Science and Technology, or S&T, educational exchanges until very recently?
Well, this assignment, I can say, was both one of the most rewarding and yet also one of the most challenging experiences I've had in almost 4 decades of working in the field of Sino-US relations. And it was challenging because, first of all, it involved 3 different kind of management challenges. The first one, of course, was developing a brand new university, a joint venture university, with all of the requirements that entailed. Everything to do with curriculum, student recruitment, student affairs, operations, as well as construction of the phase 2 of the campus. So that was a pretty tall order in and of itself. But then we had to do so within the context of, first of all joint venture universities must have a Chinese partner. Our partner was Wuhan University, and we also had a sponsor, the city of Kunshan. So we had to have, on a daily basis, very good working relationships with our Chinese counterparts. Third, we also had to have good relations with Duke. Duke was our American sponsor. And to be honest, we didn't always see eye to eye on what needed to be done on the ground in China, because circumstances in China are so very different than what they are in the United States. So just managing those 3 facets of a university in the context of doing this in China. Also, even though we were a so-called Sino-US joint venture or a bilateral project, the reality is that we were building a global university from the start. And building a global university within the context not of the United States, but in China, also offers some very unique challenges, particularly because we were constantly reminded that we had to abide by and obey the laws and regulations of the People's Republic of China. And therefore, some of the things that we take for granted in the United States about academic freedom, about privacy, et cetera, those things simply did not apply in China, and we had to earn those. One more point I want to make. Our arrangement at DKU between Duke, Wuhan, and Kunshan involved a CEA, or Cooperative Education Agreement. And in that agreement, it was a legal document signed by the Chinese government and Duke University, as well as Wuhan. And it laid out in great detail the requirements and obligations of all the parties, including requirements regarding academic freedom. So we constantly depended on that agreement to clarify what could and couldn't be done, or what needed to be done on an ongoing basis. And so, like Americans in a typical fashion, we relied extensively on contract and a rule of law, et cetera. And our Chinese friends sometimes were much more into a more fluid, constantly changing arrangement. Nonetheless, the project has been a big success. And I would say I left after 5 years feeling very good about where we were in terms of our overall academic development, our recruitment, and also the nature of a relationship between the parties that were involved in the joint venture.
Yeah, well, thank you for that very nice introduction of the general program that you built from the ground up, essentially. And this is a topic that is very near and dear to me, having participated in the Hopkins Nanjing Center back in 2015 to 2016. This is a topic that really resonates with someone like myself, who is a product of many of these very important programs. So moving on. So the level of educational exchanges between the U.S. and China can, in some ways, be seen as a bellwether of the overall bilateral relationship at large. So to start off in brief, could you give us a summary of the overall timeline of U.S.-China academic exchange and its parallels to the development of the bilateral relationship? What was or is the general trend of these exchanges in comparison with other major international educational exchanges, such as with Japan, for instance?
Okay. Well, one has to remember that even though the formal arrangements for education exchange and S&T cooperation started with a number of agreements signed in 1978, 79, we actually went all the way back to the early 70s in the time of ping pong diplomacy, when the United States National Academy of Sciences created something called the Committee for Scholarly Communication with the People's Republic of China. And for a period of almost 7 or 8 years, that organization functioned as the facilitator of sending U.S. delegations to China, bringing Chinese delegations to the United States, and even sending the first students to China when a normalization occurred in 1979. So that organization sometimes gets left out, but I think it played a very, very important role in helping to cement together and build some trust that the two countries could work together in a highly cooperative manner. After the agreement was signed, the Chinese government basically sent a relatively select number of students to the United States, mainly graduate students, and they were what we call gongfei. That is, that they were government financed students. They were paid for by the Chinese government, and they were sent to various top universities across the United States. And there were some issues and some bumps in the road about what subjects they could and could not study, et cetera. But for the most part, the relationship went very well. And then what we saw basically throughout the 80s and 1990s was the blossoming of that relationship. The only bump occurred in June 4th, 1989, of course, with the Tiananmen incident that created some havoc and some uncertainty. And one wondered at that time whether or not these exchanges were going to continue. But I'm happy to say that they did. The only damage really was done to our cooperation in space. where that was put on the sidelines after 1989, and it has really not recovered ever since. We've dabbled back again, but particularly in the recent years, it really hasn't gotten back to much substance in terms of the cooperation. I think what we've seen very interestingly is that during times of political problems in the bilateral relationship, the education and S&T relationships has continued to move forward. That they've been a kind of foundation that has helped us carry through the relationship, even when the two governments were not getting along. What makes the current period so difficult and so challenging is the fact that in this period, the S&T relationship and the education relationship actually have come under attack and great criticism. I think this started to build up during the latter years of the Obama administration, but obviously acquired full momentum during the Trump administration. Perhaps one event I would point out is that in the mid to late 1990s, we had something called the Cox Report. And the Cox Report was an investigation about allegations that Chinese were afoot in the United States, grabbing onto U.S. nuclear secrets. And in 1999, there was a redacted version of the Cox Report issued to the public, and it laid out at least a number of nefarious acts that had been committed and raised a number of questions. I think the U.S. government used that to raise these kind of issues with China, and I think things got a little bit more settled down and allowed us to continue to build. The big sea change occurred when the Chinese government basically said, look, we want to open up these educational exchanges. And so they began to allow what they called zifei, or self-funded students, to come to the United States. And then we've just seen a proliferation, particularly at the undergraduate level, of Chinese students who've come to the United States, self-paying, funded by parents or funded by scholarships, a number of different ways. But the number now is over 370,000, as we know. And even though there have been a number of questions raised recently, particularly in dealing with around the COVID problem, the reality is that the Chinese students seem very, very interested in still coming to the United States. There are concerns, of course, about issues about crime in the United States, about some violence that have occurred at the U.S. universities, about how U.S. universities are dealing with COVID. In fact, I've had to talk to a number of Chinese parents about that before they committed to send their kids back to the United States. But all in all, I think that the momentum on the Chinese side is very positive. The questions really have been raised on the U.S. side as we began to cast doubt on the utility perhaps of having so many Chinese students in the United States, and particularly having a number of Chinese scholars in the United States, some of which at least have been alleged by the FBI and other agencies to be engaged in various nefarious acts, industrial spying, theft of IP, et cetera, et cetera. And so we're now at a very difficult moment that the S&T relationship and the education relationship themselves are no longer the sustainable element, but they are the element now that is causing a lot of difficulty in the relationship. And we have yet to settle where we're headed now back into the future.
Yeah, and we'll certainly be discussing some of the newer developments, particularly the DOJ initiative in a little bit. But before we get into that discussion, I wanted to look a little bit more at the framework, looking from the Chinese side. So for those in our audience who might be less familiar, could you explain to us what China's 1,000 Talents program is, which is one of those initiatives that has been accused by the US government of allowing China greater ease for targeting US-based researchers and scientists for espionage or IP theft?
Okay.
Yeah, how is this program relevant to China's larger strategic initiatives, such as Made in China 2025? And do you think that this has led to instances of abuse of these programs at the expense of US institutions? And taking a more panoramic view, what do you think has been the contribution of returnees to China from these programs to their economic and societal development?
Okay, that's a really very important question. Anyone who studied contemporary China understands that during the period of the Cultural Revolution, intellectuals, including scientists, engineers, etc., came under attack. They had to be more read than expert, and many of them were sent to the countryside, xiaofang, in order to learn from the peasants and become more familiar with what the masses were doing, rather than live in the ivory towers that they were accused of inhabiting during that period. In 2003, I think, was a major national conference on talent. And this conference basically put in place the notion that talent is a strategic asset to China's development. And this became even more so the case in 2006, when China announced its medium and long-term plan for science and technology, in which China decided that it was going to move away from the factory to the world model, with an emphasis on manufacturing, to become much more of an innovation-driven economy. And with that emphasis on innovation, there was a recognition that you don't have much innovation unless you have creative people who are able to do their thing, that they don't feel that they're constrained, or that somehow they are unable to express their views and their opinions. And so since this period of time in 2003, 4, 5, 6, I think what we've seen is a steady improvement in the policies that were put in place to protect the interests of intellectuals and to give more degrees of freedom to scientists and engineers. But China also realized that when it started to send people abroad, it was also suffered from a problem of brain drain, that many of the best and the brightest that it sent abroad had decided not to come back to China. And there were a variety of reasons for that. But the whole point was that many of them had decided to stay abroad in the US, in Europe, and other places. So at the time, they were in the Communist Party. There's an agency called the Organization Department, which is really responsible for the talent cultivation within the party and more broadly speaking. And so Li Yuanchao, who was running the organization that time, decided to launch something called the 1,000 Talent Program. And the goal, just like it said, was to bring back 1,000 of the best and the brightest from abroad and provide them incentives and reasons for them to come back to China. Well, many of them, many Chinese Americans were interested in doing this, but they also didn't want to give up their lives in the United States or Europe. And so rather than coming back, full bore, many of them negotiated arrangements to spend part of their time in China and yet retain their positions, many of which were tenured positions back in the United States. And so they were sort of straddling the Pacific, sometime in the US, sometime in China. Many of these individuals had laboratories in China. They had graduate students, and they were responsible for an entire program, a research program in China. And many of them were compensated very nicely. The problem is that this was done without the kind of notification or communication that had to be done. And therefore, there were deans and department heads, et cetera, that were not entirely aware of all of these activities going on involving these individuals. More so on the Chinese side wasn't getting, the bang for their money that they were putting into this, because these people were only there partial time. And therefore, there was a kind of vulgarization of what the 1,000 Talent Program meant. And so both sides seem to be increasingly unhappy with this. And particularly during the Trump administration, this program became the target, the focal point of investigation, with the sense that this could be an important channel for U.S. Intellectual property to make its way back to China without the approval and knowledge of the various funding agencies or the universities themselves. And so institutions like NIH and NSF and other bodies basically became extremely concerned about how their money might be used in order to actually send intellectual property back to China. Also, there was a sense that maybe some of these people in the 1,000 Talent Program were not playing by the rules, and they may have been engaged in also nefarious acts. And so all of a sudden, the 1,000 Talent Program, which had been heralded on the Chinese side and had been accepted on the US side, all of a sudden seemed a big problem. And the Chinese government decided to downplay it. There was a website and a lot of visibility given to this program that has receded tremendously. The effort to send delegations to the US to recruit this talent, that has subsided as well, or if it hasn't, it's very low profile right now. And most important, it has led the United States at both the university level and also at the government level to raise questions about what is the loyalty of these individuals who belong to the 1,000 Talent Program. Are they expected to do things that are inconsistent with the integrity of the US research system? And therefore, are they actually doing damage to our own research establishment, which is based on the idea of openness and open exchange of information, et cetera. And there's some people felt that maybe the 1,000 Talent Program was taking unfair advantage of the United States and the way that we operate in terms of how science and technology progress occur. So today we have a 1,000 Talent Program that sort of seemingly has disappeared from the grandeur it had achieved. And not many people raise their hand when you ask them, do you belong to this? In fact, a number of people in the United States, Chinese American faculty, have had to disengage from that program, had to leave it so that they would no longer be under some suspicion that they might be engaged in acts that were either not illegal, but perhaps illicit or at least unethical. And people are trying to fix this, but I will tell you, we continue to suffer from the after effects of what has happened. And it all has to come down to one word: communication. It was sort of like a don't ask, don't tell. People on both sides of the ocean involved in these programs basically did not ask about the whereabouts, what these people were doing, and therefore it led to the kinds of problems that we see today, particularly with respect to the income and compensation people were receiving that they didn't declare back here in the United States. That is a big problem, and we still are dealing with that problem today.
Yeah, absolutely. And sticking along these lines within actions that occurred during the Trump administration, the Confucius Institutes were another program that we saw have come under fire quite a bit, under allegations that they have non-academic goals outside of their stated purpose of facilitating cultural exchange and language training. For instance, such as to promote a positive narrative of Xi Jinping's China, for instance. And this led the State Department under the Trump administration to designate the Confucius Institutes as a foreign mission. And the U.S. Senate later passed a bill that restricts colleges hosting Confucius Institutes from receiving some federal funding. Now, come to the Biden administration, early signs show that they may be willing to walk back some of these Trump-era policies, such as the withdrawing of a rule that would have required colleges that participate in the student and exchange visitor program to disclose whether or not they have financial ties to a Chinese cultural education program, such as the Confucius Institutes that frequently partner with US institutions. So how should we interpret some of these early actions from the administration, which has, for the most part, remained relatively tight-lipped on the issue? And how might we expect this to impact the overall treatment of the Confucius Institutes in the future?
Well, the Confucius Institutes, unfortunately, have become a whipping boy for some of the problems that have occurred within the relationship. And they all go back to this question of, the degree of real trust and mutual understanding. There is little doubt that the establishment of these institutes and their implementation has a lot to do with what has been called Chinese soft power or soft diplomacy, trying to establish for people, if not a favorable, at least to spread knowledge about China across the globe. And there are Confucius Institutes located everywhere in the world, on every continent, perhaps except Antarctica. And so I think that the Chinese effort to spread these without really thinking very carefully of how they might be interpreted in places like the United States really has led to a number of difficulties. And I've been at one place, I'd rather not say where, but I've been at a place where there was a sign in a hallway as you entered to go to the Confucius Institute, which said, "This is where academic freedom ends." And it was really a pronounced effort to say, look, everything that can go on in the university can't go on when you go beyond this hallway, because this is where the Confucius Institute lies. I will tell you, I am a big fan of the learning of Chinese language. And I think that one of the keys to success in my career has been my ability to read and speak Chinese. And so the fact that Confucius Institutes also sponsored the teaching of Chinese at elementary, middle school, and high school level, and prepared, perhaps could have prepared a full generation of young Americans to be fluent in Chinese, would have been a remarkable achievement, and something that not only would have benefited communication with China, but also would given us an ability to better understand China, because language is a key to understanding culture, and understanding culture is a key to understanding your counterpart wherever they come from around the world. And this is not only for Chinese, obviously, it applies to any foreign language, which is why the teaching of foreign languages is so important. What disappointed me so much, frankly, is that when all of this noise was made, the United States has a couple programs in place for helping young Americans, particularly in college age, to learn Chinese. But our education and communities at the state level and the community level, clearly in their budgets, don't have enough money to support the kind of education, foreign language training that is needed to create a generation proficient in some of these hard to master foreign languages. And clearly Chinese is one of those. So I am a little bit disappointed that this issue became so politicized. I think that, in cases of many universities, the legal counsel was involved in helping to create the agreements that allowed for the implementation of the Confucius Institutes. And I know from personal experience, I was at Penn State and I was involved in the creation there. I was at the University of Oregon where there was one, and I was at Arizona State University where there also was one. And I know that the legal agreements that were put in place protected academic freedom and were meant to establish a level of awareness that if this was going to occur, we would have to protect and defend academic freedom because we are a U.S. educational institution. Sure, there were certain limits, and I think that we wouldn't be surprised at what those limits were. But as a whole, I think that the net positive was much greater than the negative. And as I said, I think that if we did a little political management of these, we could have gotten them to continue forward without having to close so many down. And I worry now where this next generation of young people are going to get their access to foreign language training without this kind of vehicle in place right now. And I hope we can figure out a way how to do this again in the future. By the way, I don't know, but if some people may not realize, but at the same time, there were these Confucius Institutes. There were also these American culture centers that were also attempted in China. They took place at a number of institutions. When I was at ASU, for example, we had a relationship with Sichuan University, and we established, with support from the State Department, an American Cultural Center, which we taught courses and lectures about American literature, American culture, etc. The problem is that unlike the China program, the funding was very short-lived, and you got it for 1 or maybe 2 years if you were lucky. But this was unlike the Confucius Institute. So I think the United States has to recognize whether China is foe or friend, whether it's going to be our collaborator or competitor, it behooves us to have a generation of young people who have the language skills, the cultural understanding, and of course the political and economic understanding, so that we can work better together to achieve common goals.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with this. This also resonates very closely with me. I grew up in the Washington, D.C. Beltway, and yeah, attended a school which was probably one of the few in the area that did offer Chinese language classes starting all the way from the 5th grade. And there were, very, very few. And this, this is the seat of U.S. government power, and there's still very little, aside from just a select few programs that offer language training at such a young age, and even less opportunity for those who, perhaps, attend public schools and, the only, of course, Spanish, French, all great, important languages to learn, but the opportunities just aren't there really nearly as much in public education. So it's, the Confucius Institutes definitely did bring that positive, and to see that potentially squandered would definitely shoot ourselves in the foot, so to speak. But moving on to some more Trump era actions that are still being decided on today. I guess if you could discuss briefly, where things currently stand with the Department of Justice's China Initiative, and perhaps give a brief overview of where that came from exactly. You gave a few indications earlier on, that it aims to target potential instances of IP theft and espionage from Chinese S&T researchers. Do you believe that these investigations are justified or as grave as they're made out to be? So for instance, at the end of July this past year, 90 members of Congress sent out a letter to Attorney General Merrick Garland requesting that the DOJ investigation take a look into the repeated and wrongful targeting of individuals of Asian descent for alleged espionage amid multiple reports of false accusations of spying against said individuals. And earlier this July, the Justice Department dropped the prosecutions of 5 Chinese researchers, albeit for procedural reasons, who, in a highly publicized sweep last year, were accused of concealing ties to the Chinese military and spying on its behalf. This being said, there have been cases where national security concerns have been at issue, plus cases involving false statements and fraud. This led to the case of Song Guo-jung, a researcher with strong ties to China, according to the department, who was sentenced to 37 months in prison after being arrested while boarding a chartered flight to China with several USB drives and 2 laptops, and later pled guilty to lying to federal grant applications. So all things considered, is the DOJ China Initiative necessary regardless of its missteps, or is the cost too high and causing irreparable damage to real positive S&T exchange between the US and China?
Well, clearly, the China Initiative is doing damage to U.S.-China cooperation in both education and science and technology. There is little doubt about that. The level of anxiety that now exists in the Chinese American community among faculty members at universities, researchers, both in the corporate sector and in government research labs, etc. That level of anxiety has reached the highest it's ever been, and it's creating a kind of deterrent about people engaging in new projects and raising lots of questions about what is the future course of the bilateral relationship in these particular areas. Look, there are a couple of things that one can look at. Does one bad apple spoil the whole barrel? Or, another one, which, Christopher Wray, the head of the FBI, said that, look, we need to be careful of China because the Chinese approach is a whole of society approach in their effort, and they use quote unquote non-traditional collectors to gather information and bring it back to China. This all left a kind of taint and created a kind of suspicion that perhaps every Chinese is suspect of engaging in some kind of illicit act and bringing back the crown jewels from the US to China. And I think nothing could be further from the truth. I've been supporting and engaged in US-China collaboration for close to 4 decades. I must have written over 250 invitation letters throughout my career to have Chinese scholars come to the United States. Now, unlike some people, I have monitored them and I brought them to the U.S. so I knew where they were 95% of the time. And the nature of the relationship that we had was that they reported to me. But I know there are instances where, people land and maybe they have a spouse at another university. They get permission to come to University A, but before you know it, they end up spending most of their time at University B. These are natural things that happen with the nature of life and society, etc. Those people, they may violate the spirit of their invitation, but they haven't necessarily broken any laws. I would not at all disagree that there are a few bad apples in the barrel. And I would say that most of these bad apples are people who are opportunists. They are people that basically see an opportunity to take advantage of access they have to privileged information, and they take it upon themselves. I don't think, and I don't see, for example, compared to what the KGB and GRU were doing from the former Soviet Union, compared to that level of centralized tasking, control, etc., I don't see that in operation today. That doesn't mean there's not spying going on. Frankly, we spy on China, China spies on us. China listens to our phone calls, we listen to theirs. This goes on and on. But what the US government has been really concerned about is commercial espionage. And that is the cyber hacking and also IP theft that reached a certain level, and particularly as the Obama administration began to wind down. I was a member of the U.S. China Innovation Dialogue between OSTP and the Ministry of Science and Technology. And by the end of the Obama administration, the U.S. Congress had become totally jaded about the relationship with China, and they were not very supportive of continuing forward. I would make the argument that what we need to do is that the agreement that started all this off in 78, 79 has been the same agreement in place for the last 40 plus years. No changes, no real modifications in terms of the framework that was established. And yet, the nature of the bilateral relationship has changed in many fundamental ways. The relationship used to be very asymmetrical and very hierarchical. It's now, we're much closer to parity in capability. And so that nature has changed. We used to think of China as an innovation laggard. Now we think of China as an innovation juggernaut. I remember an article in Harvard Business Review just a few years ago entitled, "Why China Can't Innovate." And now we're worried about China literally eating our lunch. So I think that this initiative, I am convinced, yes, we need to do a better job of understanding who is coming to the United States, what's their purpose, and where they're going. And the host organizations, the universities, need to be much more compliant with the rules that have been put in place about understanding their responsibilities and obligations for looking after who has come and what they're doing. That said, I think that the key to the United States' success in science and technology, its ability to innovate, has benefited from these kind of scholarly exchanges and student exchanges. It's benefited from the kind of government-to-government collaboration that's taken place. The thing that we didn't expect to happen was that the private-to-private exchanges between universities, corporations, think tanks has far surpassed the level of the government bilateral cooperation, and it has grown by leaps and bounds. We do not have in place a sufficient institutional mechanism to oversee the size and the scope of where we are right now. And I think that what needs to be done is we need an S&T Cooperation Agreement 2.0 or an Education Exchange Agreement 2.0 that basically is a product of a renegotiation of where we are, what we've learned from the past in terms of both problems and opportunities, and an honest exchange of what those problems are. And they range in everything from equal access. China may say, well, we don't allow Google or Facebook or whatever, but the Chinese would like to have Alibaba and Tencent and TikTok, et cetera here. We need to iron out some of those things and we need to establish rules of the road going forward for how the two countries will work together in an age in which the nature of their relationship has changed dramatically from what it was when we began this kind of collaboration almost 4 decades ago.
Yeah, absolutely. And, regardless of, how many instances of IP theft or espionage comes out of this DOJ initiative that turns out to be true or even false, it's not to say that these cases are not important at all, of course. But no matter how much or how little blame is warranted on either side, much of the onus will certainly be placed on China to restore confidence in S&T related educational exchanges if the American government, businesses, and universities are to resume building out these exchange programs. So what do you think are some steps that China can take, both in the near term and long term, in order to begin restoring this confidence in the U.S.? Just because the environment here, the atmosphere here is so dim. Frankly, it's very, very stark right now.
Well, again, to take another euphemism, it takes two to tango.
Sure.
So I'm not so sure this is there are a number of things that unilaterally the Chinese will do in order to say, well, we're going to look good or whatever. I think that this really does have to be a collaborative exercise in which relevant institutions on both sides, perhaps groups of universities, perhaps groups of corporations, etc., sit down together and they lay out really what are the key problems of concern that are standing in the way of better and expanded collaboration. I think we have to be honest, we have to be very clear, and most important, we have to be very direct. And I think that in establishing what I called before these rules of the road, I think we have to be clear. If an institution is guilty of violating those rules, then they don't get to participate going forward. I think we have to have some kind of punitive measures in place that take those who misbehave or don't adhere to their responsibilities and sanction them. On the other hand, I also want to encourage all of those who are playing by the rules to not be fearful of renewing ties, because I think, as I said before, the relationship benefited so much from the trust and understanding that was established through the positive sum win-win effects of this kind of collaboration, that I think that it can once again be revitalized and rekindled if we can get to the point where we actually willingly sit down and talk to each other, no matter how difficult and how uncomfortable some of that discussion might become. I think this is one of those cases where we don't need the discussions to be blasted in the New York Times or the Chronicle of Higher Education. I'm a firm believer that we get more out of working with China through quiet diplomacy. And I think that allowing the players who are involved to lay their cards on the table and say, look, this is what we need from you, and this is what you need from us. This is what we're willing to do. And I think that based on what I've seen, reading the Chinese media and the Chinese press, China remains committed up to the highest levels, including Xi Jinping, of having a broad base of international collaborations relationships in place. I'm doing some work on China's international S&T relationships, and China now has relations with over 150 different countries in which it has cooperative S&T accords. It is a very, very important part of China's not only foreign policy, but it's an important part of its own S&T development. And it's very clear that China has benefited tremendously from being entering the world economy and opening up at a time of globalization. If there's been one country in the world that has benefited thoroughly from globalization, it's been China. And therefore, China would find it a loser in some ways if, in fact, the doors would start to close and these the levels of collaboration would be significantly reduced. So I'm hopeful that everyone will come clean, in other words, with what needs to be done, that will clean out some of the problem areas, and that within that barrel of apples, we'll get rid of those few apples that are causing the whole barrel to be tainted, and that we can move forward in the future in a much more positive some way.
Yeah, and outside of just the realm of international education, we've seen increasing calls for S&T decoupling at the business level as well, of course, which has led to sanctions against major Chinese tech companies and disruptions to mergers and acquisitions. And this has, in turn, has led China to really hunker down, so to speak, and find replacements for key technological components outside of the United States or other Western countries, in addition to bolstering its own domestic hardware manufacturing and software development prowess. So in your view, is it right to assume that an inevitable degree of decoupling may also set in within the educational side of S&T between the US and China along these trend lines in the business world?
Well, if the current trend lines continue, clearly in fields such as AI, quantum computing, specialty materials, certain areas of life sciences, these are considered to be highly sensitive areas, but even more importantly, they are key areas in terms of the future competition between the two countries. And therefore, I think there are some people that say, well, why are we going to allow Chinese students and scholars to come to our best institutions to learn all that they can, and then we're going to just basically send them back home? Or they're going to take back home with them the jewels that they learn from their participation. Look, again, I think openness benefits both countries. I think that our whole experience since the post-war period, if not before that, has shown clear evidence that we benefit from having an open exchange with other countries and allowing new ideas to percolate within the American academic environment, with the American research environment, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that, look, what's happened with companies like Huawei and ZTE and other such organizations, I mean, I think that, again, we have to have some degree of vigilance about the consequences of over-dependence or over-reliance on any one source for our technology. It is a little bit difficult to understand how the United States, supposedly the world's leading technological power, could fall victim to having to, perhaps depend on Huawei technology to develop our 5G networks here in the United States. I can understand the concern that some people might have. But the United States, as you know, has taken this as a kind of vendetta and brought this at the kind of the global level. Not only are we trying to protect ourselves, but we're also talking to our allies in Europe and everywhere else around the world that how they should wean themselves off of reliance on certain Chinese companies who may end up posing a national security threat. Again, I think that rather than talk about these kind of issues indirectly and through the media, et cetera, we ought to have much more face-to-face consultation with the Chinese about what really is at issue, what concerns the United States. If we have evidence that Huawei equipment has certain backdoors in it and certain loopholes, access to the software, et cetera, we need to demonstrate that to our Chinese counterparts. Again, I don't think we need to do that in the New York Times or Wall Street Journal, but I think we need to demonstrate that to our Chinese counterparts so they understand why we're really concerned. But there's an irony to what's going on that really has me very concerned. In 1978, when the Chinese announced, their reform and opening up initiatives, the United States heralded this. We wanted China to become part of the mainstream of the global economy. We did everything we could to make China a constructive member of the international system, and as one of a former State Department leaders said, a stakeholder with a vested interest, in making that system and work and supporting that system. Now, if China kind of feels in a corner, backed into a corner, because we're withholding access to these technologies, and it does pursue a policy of greater self-reliance, China will move backwards. In other words, it will be moving just in the opposite direction that we wanted it to. And therefore, if China were to have less of a stake less of a vested interest in the international system, it will start to develop. We will start to see a bifurcated international system. China right now, for example, is extremely active in following its Belt and Road Initiative across Central Asia, all the way going through Africa and into parts of Eastern Europe and into Latin America. It is now working on establishing technical standards with the 65 plus countries that are part of the Belt and Road Initiative. One could imagine if the Chinese were successful in doing that, that we would now have competing standards in effect, and that those competing standards would have commercial implications, and they would cause havoc in the international system. China is now become extremely proactive in terms of making itself and its influence grow in terms of international S&T related organizations. So we're not seeing any longer a passive China sitting on the sidelines. We're seeing a China that wants to have a seat at the table. And as one of my friends, Mike Lampton, has said, China is no longer simply a rule taker or a rule breaker. Today, it wants to become a rule maker. And I think that what the United States has to recognize is that going forward, and particularly given what I said about China's progress in science and technology, that it now commands a seat at the table, and that the world going forward is going to look somewhat different, because we're going to have now what the people might say the elephant in the room is a big China, a capable China. That doesn't mean China is going to prevail over us. It doesn't mean that China is ostensibly a kind of endemic threat to us, but it does mean that China wants a piece of the pie, and it wants a share of that. And I think that we're going to have to learn how to play nice with another country that is very powerful, very influential, and very capable in terms of how the world's S&T system will look going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of China now being more of a rule maker now, so taking a look at some of the massive changes that we're seeing in China's education system, we've seen Chinese education authorities terminating almost 300 cooperative programs between Chinese and foreign universities as part of a routine assessment of collaborative arrangements with foreign institutions. And this move comes less than a month after the State Council had issued new sweeping regulations for the private education industry, forcing companies to register as nonprofit organizations, banning approvals for new companies and barring them from accepting foreign investment. And you only have to look at the tickers on the stock market to see what that's been doing to Wall Street. So could you talk to us about the drivers of some of these decisions, as well as their wisdom or lack thereof? And how do you think it will impact U.S. China collaboration in the international education exchange space?
Okay, so sometimes you get what you might call a perfect storm. A number of things come together and people assume, well, they're all linked together. So when I first arrived at Kunshan in 2015, I think it was about a year later, the Chinese government, through the Ministry of Education, announced a similar kind of shutdown of 200 plus collaborative programs with foreign universities. And you have to understand that for the last 20, 25 years, Chinese universities also have been engaged in a process of internationalization, and they've looked to foster the development of collaborative ties with many, many universities abroad in the US, in Europe, Japan, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that one of the things we have to understand is that many of them simply accumulated large numbers of these relationships, and many of which became almost defunct from the moment the ink was dry on the agreement. Many of them never amounted to very much. And the first cut that took place, I guess, about 6 or 7 years ago, has now been accompanied by a second cut. And this second cut, more or less, is meant to do the same thing, to get these programs off the books, which basically have either they've never been implemented or they have no efficacy in terms of bringing value to any of the partners. And I think that in the past, a lot of universities use these as quantitative measures to show, oh, look how internationalized we are. But really, it's much better, from my experience as being a vice provost for international affairs, to have fewer but more substantive relationships than it is to have many that really don't add up to very much. So I'm not worried about what went on just now. I think this is a natural course of events. But I am a little bit surprised at the degree to which, through the instruction from the very top, these education companies and the tutoring companies were cracked down upon so swiftly and in such a dramatic fashion. And as we know, you indicated, Wall Street has seen, and the stock market, let me say, has seen tremendous loss of value, and investors have lost a lot of money because of what happened. If you've been reading the Chinese media over the last couple of weeks, Xi Jinping has started to talk about a new concept dealing with shared prosperity. You may remember Deng Xiaoping said at the beginning of the reform program, it's glorious to become rich. And he gave sanction basically to making money and for people to accumulate, wealth, etc. But I think it always left unanswered a question: how rich is too rich? And I think we've seen a massive increase in income inequality over the last number of years. The Gini coefficient, while it's improved slightly in some areas, I think it's still a big problem in China. And I think what Xi Jinping has seen is that some people are extreme beneficiaries of the ability to become rich, and other people are remaining stagnant. You may recall that Xi Jinping admonished the country to alleviate poverty. And this has been one of the big programs that have been put forth by Xi Jinping, and one of the sources of great pride in what he's achieved during his period in power. I think that we're going to see a China right now, the face is going to change somewhat. And this new emphasis on shared prosperity, we're going to see this kind of crackdown occur in the future. Now, that said, I don't think that Xi Jinping is saying to anybody he doesn't want to have an educated population, that he doesn't want to have young people who are highly capable. He just wants to do something that manages access to these resources. And I know I have a friend of mine, and we've talked about this at great length. And one of the things we've talked about is, why don't these companies establish a fund? And every year, X amount of their profits will go to establishing a fund that would allow children from poor areas to get the kind of tutoring and special education that they need, so that they can then access eventually universities like Tsinghua and Beida, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that, Xi has put his finger on an important problem in Chinese society, which is income inequality and social inequality. But I think the thing that he must realize that's very important, that China now is a country of international influence and a country of international presence. And what China does or does not do carries some weight into that system, whether it's the stock market or it's the grain market or the steel market, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that this is something that China now has to recognize. With its ascendancy, or its rise, as President Xi likes to say, also has come new responsibilities, new obligations, and new sensitivities. And I think that one of the things that has to happen is that when these dramatic actions are taken, that they are no longer part of an inward-looking China or an insular China. They're part of a China that is now globally connected, globally networked, and increasingly globally integrated. And even if we have trade problems with China or S&T, cooperation issues, the fact is that the level of interdependence between China and the West has far surpassed anything that anyone could have imagined in those early days of engagement after the Cultural Revolution. And so we have to face a new reality, as the Chinese have to do. We are now functional members of a new world system, and with that carries responsibilities for everybody to not only pay attention to the existing rules, but as we evolve new rules of engagement, that those rules now reflect the realities that we face here in 2021 and going forward, that they can have some increased relevance for all those who are in the game. I'm always cautiously optimistic about these things. I think that both sides will kind of figure it out. I think the Biden administration is trying to figure out a overall policy for China under which decisions regarding education, S&T cooperation, et cetera, can all be worked through. And I think that right now we're at that point of transition where we don't know exactly what it's going to look like. But I think my understanding is that once that holistic policy is put in place, answers to a lot of the questions that still are out there will be answered, and we'll be able to move forward, hopefully, in a much more productive fashion.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we're nearing the end of our time, just have one more question, and it's kind of the other side of the coin on these issues. These days, you can never go through a conversation without bringing up COVID-19, of course, right. And the changes that will naturally have to occur as a result of it. That's been forced upon us. So, the fact that we're speaking virtually as opposed to interviewing you in person has naturally made academic exchange across the world far more challenging. However, as the dust begins to settle with COVID, and a new normal of exchange will inevitably resume. So do you see any early indications as to what the post-COVID, or if we're continuing to live with COVID, what that environment will look like for intellectual exchange in science and technology? And do you believe that any of these changes are going to be permanent, or really just short-term difficulties that will eventually be fleshed out? And to what extent might these changes resulting from COVID-19 play into the overall U.S. China S&T academic exchange more specifically? And on a related note, you've also talked about the need to craft a new framework of cooperative U.S. China S&T arrangements, now that what was once a highly asymmetric relationship in S&T development has assumed a greater degree of parity in terms of capabilities. So what finally do you see what should the outlines of such a cooperative bilateral S&T arrangement, including the area of educational exchanges, look like to you?
Sure. It's well, let me talk about COVID for a minute, because obviously that's created a problem for every country in the world in terms of travel, engagement, and having people with their feet on the ground, working together, talking to one another, discussing issues face to face. I think the big problem for China right now is their big concern not only about COVID, but it also has to do with the Olympics that are coming next year in February. And I think the Chinese watched very carefully what went on in Tokyo, and to their probably great concern, I don't think they want to have an Olympics that is similar in the way that the Tokyo Olympics had to be carried out. I think they want to have people come, et cetera, et cetera. So I think, I think things were moving in a positive direction until the Delta variant came. And as you know, we haven't seen the last of COVID variants yet. We're probably going to see some other variants begin to appear. And everyone I speak to talks to spring 2022 as the time where some of this dust will be lifted, and we can begin to see much more of a two-way flow of people going back and forth. I would say that, look, things are very, very difficult talking through Zoom and trying to figure out these problems. China is a relationship culture. It's a society in which understanding and trust are built through face-to-face engagement, whether it be in one language, Chinese, or in two languages, English and Chinese. The reality is that face-to-face communication is very, very important. Understanding body language, understanding all different facets of how people react under different situational constraints and opportunities. These are all very critical. And I think it hurts us to not to be able to have that ability to travel right now. But I think that maybe out of all of this can come some good things. And those good things are that both countries can begin to realize that a constrained relationship, one that is restrictive and one that is difficult to implement, is not going to be very fruitful for either country. And that the big win for both countries, the mutual benefit that comes from both countries, really will come from, in effect, the fact that they can work together so that the equation 1 + 1 = 3 that the synergies to be had from the collaboration between the two countries are so much greater than the threats and the problems that we face today, that the people will begin to realize what we have at stake. I'll just go one step further. There is no single international S&T related problem, climate change, clean energy, clean water, health, and pandemics that will not require some kind of meaningful collaboration between the US and China. So at stake is not just our bilateral interests, but also the global interest. And I'm hoping that the leaders in both countries will realize, with the support from their respective allies and counterparts, that in fact, there is so much more to gain from working together. And so I hope that COVID has taught everyone, we lose when we don't communicate. We lose when we don't have transparency. And we lose when we don't basically work together towards a common goal. And so I'm hoping that COVID will be that cloud with a silver lining, in which basically the two countries see what they have lost and all that they stand to gain from a better working relationship.
Absolutely. And I think that sentiment is definitely shared by many as well, both within and outside of the Beltway as well. At some level, I mean, it's really critical to have these face-to-face exchanges. Aside from just the Zoom fatigue, I mean, it's really those meaningful conversations and relationships you build over the years. And
exactly.
Really hope that we can resume that once again. So thank you again so much for taking the time to join us for this installment of American Voices Initiatives. And we very much enjoyed having you and look forward to having you on some of our future programs. So thank you again. And we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you very much. And thanks for the great questions.